For the CPU, I'm going with the AMD Ryzen 7 9700X. It's got 8 cores, 16 threads. Now, this initially had a pretty rocky start when it launched, and that's because the pricing wasn't very good and the performance increase over the 7700X, it just wasn't worthwhile. It wasn't what we were hoping for. Since then, they have made some updates, including a new 105 watt option in the BIOS if you want, more performance out of it. But for me, I'm actually going to be sticking with the 65 watt TDP, and that's because I'll be using a low profile CPU cooler. This obviously isn't going to get you the kind of performance that a 9800X380 would get, but this is also like $200 cheaper. For the motherboard, I'm going with the Asus ROG Strix B650EI. I've used this in so many builds at this point, and that's just because I feel like it's one of the most well-balanced motherboards out there. It has this really nice black understated design, so it's not trying to be too flashy. You've got 2 M.2 slots, so that's one under this heatsink here, and then another one on the back. Plenty of USB ports and Wi-Fi 6E, and then you've also got a flashback button if you need it. So the SSD that I'm using is this 4 terabyte Gen 4 drive from WD Black. I actually haven't used a drive from them before. I picked it up on an Amazon sale, so this will be the first time. I also really like the drives from Samsung, so I'll get like a 980 Pro or a 990 Pro, although a 990 would probably be a little bit overkill for this particular build, but I'm sure that this drive will be just fine. Now we're ready to install our RAM. I've got this set from Corsair. It's 32 gigs of DDR5 6000 memory. Yeah, it's a low profile set, so that's going to be good for just about any low profile CPU cooler as well. And DDR5 6000, it's been the sweet spot for AM5 platforms at this point. You're not going to have any sort of stability problems or anything like that. It also includes an AMD Expo memory profile. That's an overclocking profile that you could set in the BIOS so that you get that advertised 6000 megahertz of speed. If you were to go with anything higher, like 7200 or above that, you could run into some stability issues, and the performance increase that you would get is not really worth the extra effort. Now, something to understand about the Fractal Terra, which is the case that we're going to be using in this instance, is there is what's called an adjustable center, meaning depending on the thickness or the width of the GPU, that's going to take away from the amount of CPU cooler clearance that we're going to have. What you have to do is account for both the CPU cooler's height along with the width or the thickness of your GPU in order to determine what's going to fit in the case. So the example here is I'm going to be going with a Prime graphics card, and we're going to just choose the 5070 Ti version right now. That's actually the same size as this 5060 Ti that we're going to be using in this build. It's the same cooler size, so it's not loaded into the website yet because it's brand new. So now that we know that the selected GPU width is 126 millimeters, the max CPU cooler height we're going to be able to fit is 70 millimeters. Now, there's a couple of good options that you could go with for 70 millimeters. Probably the most popular would be the NHL12S. This one is exactly 70 millimeters in height, and probably the one I would recommend most people going with. And that's actually for a couple of reasons. So the first reason being the fan is actually underneath the fin stack. When your fan's pushed up close against the side panel, especially in a case like the Fractal Terra, there can be turbulence, and that can be a very annoying, maybe even like a whiny noise, and you don't really want that. Another option though would be something like the NHL965. This one does have the fan on the top. However, there would be a 5 millimeter gap between the side panel and the fan, and that should be enough room to prevent any turbulence noises. So there's actually 2 types of brackets that you can use with the CPU cooler. You've got these shorter ones here that can be placed above and below the CPU cooler like that. And what that allows you to do is mount your CPU cooler this way. The other option is these longer ones that allow you to go like this. But for this particular motherboard, the best way to fit this CPU cooler is in this orientation. And then we can apply our thermal paste onto the CPU. And then lower the cooler over the CPU, aligning it with the standoffs. Finally, the last thing we need to do is take the fan connector from the CPU cooler and then plug it into the CPU fan header. And that's the motherboard prep. So now we can move on to the case. Now, I've used the Fractal Terra before. I had the black one and I've tried the green one, but this is actually going to be the first time I've seen in person the silver version. So I'm actually kind of excited about it. So one of the problems I had with the black Terra is that the finish had kind of a texture to it, which sounds nice. But the problem is every time I would touch it with my hands, it would leave like fingerprint marks. But the finish on the silver one is it's much better. I am also just really partial to silver anyways. Okay, so getting into this case is pretty straightforward. There's this little black tab on the back here. If you pull it back, it'll unlatch the top. From there, you can remove that. And then these side panels come off as well. So they open up from the bottom, and then there's these tabs that you push in, and that'll unlatch it. So this is where you can start to see the adjustable center that I was talking about earlier. So this whole centerpiece can move from one side or the other depending on how much space you need for either your CPU cooler or your GPU. And then if you check inside the accessories box, you'll find some screws that we can use to secure the motherboard. And now that the motherboard's secure, we can now plug in our case I/O. So right here, we got the USB 3, a USB-C cable, and then the front power button, which all are going to be along this side of the motherboard. So now it's time for the power supply, and I'm going to be going with the Corsair SF750. This is the older, like 2023 version and before. I have one of the new ones in a 1000 watt, which is going to be way overkill for this build. I don't need 1000 watts for this, but just so you know, if you get a new one, it'll look a little bit different from this one, but it's got the newer connectors and you know, it's a little bit better. It's a little more improved. So the power supply is actually going to fit right here next to the motherboard. But what we need to do is take this bracket out and attach it to the unit. So to get that power supply bracket off, we just need to flip the case over and then remove these two screws on the back. Before we put the power supply unit back into the case, I'm actually going to fit a 120 millimeter fan at the bottom as exhaust. There should be just enough room to clear the power supply unit and the cables coming out from the bottom, you know, if you do your cable management right. Or if you use some custom cables, which I actually might do in this build. The next thing I would highly recommend you do at this point is to get a fan grill. So it looks like this. They are pretty inexpensive. I think they're like $7 or something like that on Amazon. Very inexpensive. But what you're gonna do is you wanna put that over this fan down here. And that's because the bottom of this power supply, where these cables start coming out, can feed right into the fan. And then you're gonna get a very annoying noise whenever the fan is turning and a cable gets caught in it. For this particular case, I actually find it easier to install the fan grill after I've installed the fan, just because it's kind of tight to fit the fan in through this little hole here. But once you have the fan slotted in there, you can just kind of slide the fan grill right over it, kind of carefully. There we go. And then you can use a couple of fan screws to secure it down. With the bottom fan installed, we can install our power supply unit now into the case. It's going to be much easier to plug in the power connectors before we secure the entire unit into the case. Otherwise, it's going to be a pretty tight fit with that fan in there. And another thing to consider is that if you're going to put that fan at the bottom, this is going to limit that space for cable management. You can pull it off with the cables that are in the box, but again, it's going to be a tight fit, and I would recommend going with a slim fan instead. That way you can get a little bit of extra space there. But if you can, getting custom cables is going to make this significantly easier to manage. Now, I'll put the custom length cables that I'm using in the description. It's a very short motherboard cable and a custom length CPU cable, along with an 8-pin for the GPU. At this point, the CPU cooler is still protruding a little bit outside of the case. We're not going to be able to fit our side panel on because it's going to hit against it. The nice thing about the Terra is that at any point in the build, you can still adjust that center spine. To do that, there's actually 4 screw points, and those 4 points are located where the orange plastic pieces are positioned. Once those are unscrewed, we can freely adjust the center spine to where we need it. I'm going to put mine in between the number 2 and the number 3. That's going to give me just enough room to clear the side panel for my CPU cooler and still enough room for my GPU on the other side. Speaking of the GPU, we're going to be using the 5060 Ti. And there's a lot we need to talk about here. So let me take you back 2 years ago. The launch of the 4060 Ti was a complete disaster. First off, it came out at $400 and $500, depending on if you got the 8 gig version or the 16 gig version, which already was confusing enough as it is. Then the performance difference between those cards and the previous generation went from 0%, basically no performance increase, to around 15%, depending on which titles you were looking at. It was marketed as a 1080p card, which felt pretty bad at $400 to $500, depending on which version you got. And yeah, as much of a disaster as the 40 series launch was, the 4060 Ti was especially bad. Now, fast forward to today, we got the 5060 Ti, again, an 8 gig version and a 16 gig version. And yeah, this launch is a complete mess as well. Now, to be fair, this launch is bad for different reasons. So first of all, they decreased the price of the 8 gig version. So it was $400, now it's $380. They also decreased the price of the 16 gig by a much larger amount, $70. So it was $500, now it's $430. But here's the thing. Good luck getting these cards at this MSRP. It's gonna be borderline impossible. In fact, right now on Newegg, they are all sold out. And the only one that was even selling at that MSRP was this one from PNY. And who knows how many of those they actually had in stock. On top of all this, reviewers weren't even sent the 8 gig version. And so initial reviews are only for the 16 gig one. Now that the 8 gig version is out in the wild, it is exactly what everyone feared and really confirmed what we already knew, which is that 8 gigs is just clearly not enough for a brand new card in 2025. But I've done some of my own testing on this card, and speaking strictly about the 16 gig version, it's actually a good offering from NVIDIA. It's good performance at a decent MSRP. But again, MSRP doesn't matter much these days, and a lot of these cards are north of $500. This is getting very close to 5070 pricing, which have been going in and out of stock, and some even at that $550 MSRP. This one I have from Asus is $50 over NVIDIA's suggested pricing on Best Buy. It's got a very overbuilt cooler for this 180 watt TGP. The upside to that is that it's a very quiet and cool running card. It also comes factory overclocked, and you know, aesthetically speaking, I think it's a really nice cooler design. It matches very well with the silver Fractal Terra. Installing the GPU in this case is actually very simple as well. There are 2 thumb screws that attach the riser cable on the opposite side here. Then there's one more on the back of the case. This releases the riser cable from the case. And at the top of the PCI Express plate, there's a couple of thumb screws that we can remove. From there, attach the GPU, secure those thumb screws, and then we can secure this whole piece back into the case. All that's left to do is plug in the riser cable and that 8-pin connector to the GPU. We can put the panels back on, and that's the build complete. Okay, so now we got a fresh install of Windows, we got the drivers updated, all of that good stuff is done, and let's test out the gaming performance of this. So I figure what better way to do that than to test out the brand new release, Elder Scrolls 4 Oblivion Remastered. I want to test out the native performance of this, so I want to turn off all of the upscaling, and by default, we've got it at Ultra, ray tracing's off, TAA, all upscaling is off, and let's see how that performs. And so here we are now on the open world, which is going to be far more demanding to run than those sewers in the beginning. And so I'm seeing something a little bit closer to 30 to 40 frames per second. Still, everything looks pretty good, but I think we can do a little bit better. I don't think this is realistically how most people would end up playing this game, especially when you have things like DLSS, frame generation, stuff like that. So putting it on DLSS quality, there's definitely an improvement here, hitting around 50 to 60 frames per second. Now there's also the option for frame generation, so toggling that on, and it's a very noticeable difference. I mean, we're getting around 100 to 130 frames per second, and the motion fluidity here is definitely much, much better. Okay, so now we're gonna try out Assassin's Creed Shadows. Again, it's another fairly recent release, ultra high preset, 1440p, and no upscaling or frame generation. And running through the open world, anywhere between 40 to 50 frames per second. Temperatures are looking very good. GPU has been sitting around 60 degrees Celsius. CPU can be anywhere between 70 degrees and 80 degrees. But yeah, again, realistically, I don't think this is how most people would actually play a story-based, very graphically heavy game like this on a brand new 50 series GPU. I would actually turn on the DLSS upscaler, and we'll put this at quality for now. With the 50 series cards, you do have the option of using a 3x and a 4x frame generation. And if you max it out with that 4x frame generation, I mean, we're looking at, 150 frames per second, which is pretty crazy. Now, to be clear, that's not performance, right? Do not mistake that frame rate as performance. That is fake frames, as some people like to call it, but basically frames that are added in between 2 rendered frames. So in this case, there's 4 generated frames in between 2 natively rendered frames. And What that means is there can be artifacting, there can be other weird visual issues, and sometimes there could be some input lag. Playing this one right now with at the 160 plus frames per second, that 4x frame generation, it feels fine. It feels great, actually. I'm not really noticing any additional input lag, honestly, using it. I would play it like this. Usually I like the 2x frame generation better. It does depend on the application. I've seen in games like Hogwarts Legacy where the artifacting around characters when moving and other objects in motion, that you'd get these weird halo effects and things like that, which I really find distracting. I've actually been playing the whole game like this on my 50 series because it's nice just to max out the high refresh rate monitor. Now, what I don't like is when some developers use this as a crutch for bad optimization. That's not good. I like this frame generation stuff for lower powered machines, maybe gaming laptops, or it'd be cool if multi-frame generation came to handhelds, stuff like that. That'd be very cool. What I don't want to see is developers, not optimizing their games and leaning on this to hit 60 frames per second. That's unacceptable, because something important to note is that if this is under 60 frames per second, if your base frame rate is under 60 frames per second, the frame generation will, exceed the 60, but it will feel very bad to play. Like it just doesn't feel good. With all that said, look at this as a bonus. I wouldn't go out my way to buy a 50 series card just for multi-frame generation. It's just, again, a nice bonus. I would say that noise levels are tolerable as well, around 45 to 46 decibels under a full GPU load, with the loudest part being a little bit of turbulence noise coming from the bottom fan. So it's been around 2 years since the last time I did a complete build in the Terra, and it's been nice revisiting it. I can see why it's maintained its popularity for all of this time. It's easy to build in. Aesthetically, it looks really nice. I know a lot of people like it, myself included. And, as long as you are okay with only air cooling your CPU, and of course, choosing an appropriate CPU, something that can be easily cooled with a low profile CPU cooler, then, I think most people are still going to be in 2025 happy with the Fractal Terra.